This is Mindwars. I'm Chris Ryan, and on today's show we have Wilfred Wong, former barrister living in London. Wilfred has been investigating and exposing SRA for 27 years now, and has met countless victims over the years telling their stories of these horrific sexual torture, abuse acts and satanic rituals they were made to take part in. Wilfred, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, first of all, before we get into this very vast and deep and dark topic, just give us a small bit of a background on yourself, and when was your awakening or your crossing on this path 27 years ago that you came across SRA for the first time?
I first read about SRA in 1992. There were a number of books coming out at the time on SRA, and there was more exposure of the issue at that time in the media. That all kind of fizzled out around the mid-90s. I read about it, and so in 1993, January, when I was approached by a British MP to help him with a case of SRA that had been brought to his attention, I was very happy to help. I knew some of the basics about the issue, and I went to visit someone who had approached the MP about SRA. Now, this person was helping several SRA survivors, and all of them were in quite a traumatized condition. They had DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, commonly known in the past as multiple personality disorder. And so I found myself in a building full of SRA survivors with DID, and I saw some of them shifting from one alter personality to another alter. DID is not a disease or an illness, it is a survival mechanism. Because the SRA survivors that I met on that occasion had all been ritually abused since a very young age. And when that happens to a child, that they're abused at such an early age, when their personality is not even fully formed yet, they're more likely, as a way to cope with the sheer trauma. It's horrific trauma. Imagine subjecting a child to torture and sex abuse. How can the child mentally cope with it? Their survival mechanism is to fragment their personality. Their core personality fragments into a couple of different alter personalities, because that's the only way that they can mentally cope with the trauma, which is increased even more when it's their own parents doing it to them, because they can't get their head round how can their parents, who take care of them the rest of the time and seem to be loving them, do such horrific things to them. So, for example, if it's an alter bearing the brunt of the trauma and the torture, they can reason with themselves that, oh, it's not me who's being tortured by my parents, it's whatever the name of the alter is who's suffering that torture from my parents. They can distance themselves psychologically from the abuse and the torture by attributing it to another victim, one of the alters, who's actually suffering that trauma. So it is an effective coping mechanism for the children. DID actually can be seen as quite an ingenious way of coping with extreme stress and abuse and torture. And the problem is, of course, when they grow older and when they are trying to function in the world, they need to integrate their personality, and there's a lot of pressure on them to integrate their personality, which has been fragmented. And it usually takes years to integrate the altars. Sometimes the altars can run into the hundreds. I have met SRA survivors who had hundreds of altars. And you can only imagine just how horrific their experiences must have been to fragment into so many altar personalities from such an early age. And this is one of the key issues that SRA survivors, when they're adults, have to cope with, have to go for therapy to try and help them reintegrate their personality, to try and help them heal from the trauma they suffered. And of course, one important part of that healing process is to get justice against their abusers. Many SRA survivors want justice against their abusers, not just for their healing, although it does help their healing, but also to help other children not suffer the same nightmare that they went through, to prevent other children from being subjected to that nightmare. Unfortunately, in many cases in the UK, they are told by the police there's not enough evidence to continue investigating the case. This is the usual excuse used by the police, that there isn't enough evidence to investigate their case. In many cases, the real reason is that, not that there isn't enough evidence, is that there isn't enough will by the police to investigate the case. The police don't take whatever evidence has been presented to them by the SRA survivor and use it as a stepping stone to move an investigation forward and thoroughly investigate based on what they have so as to gather more evidence. The police often don't even bother to do that or bother to check some of the most basic things. I know, for example, SRA cases where the police don't even interview all the people who have been named. So, for example, you may be aware of the Holly Gregg case. In the Holly Gregg case, the Scottish SRA case, quite a big one, Holly Gregg was or is a woman who has Down syndrome, and from an early age was subjected by her Satanist father to SRA. And she named in total 23 people who abused her, and they abused her in Satanist ceremonies. So we're talking about SRA here, including her description of human sacrifice that she saw, and also an animal sacrifice that she witnessed firsthand. And of the 23 people that she named, 3 were head teachers. One was a senior forensics police officer, and one was a judge, and 2 social workers. It's an interesting microcosm of the different levels of society involved in SRA. The police, out of those, well, she named 22 to the police. The 23rd one she named later on, but by that time the police had shut down the investigation. So she didn't have an opportunity to give that name to the police. And the 23rd one, by the way, is a head teacher, who's still a head teacher so far as we know. The police, out of the 22 suspects named to them, only ever interviewed 2 of them. 2 out of 22. That, you don't have to be a law enforcement specialist to know that there's something wrong there, and they're not doing a very thorough job.
And do you believe the police are, because to certain police it's a taboo, and because other situations it might be because some of the police are involved themselves, so they're not going to investigate any further, kind of brushed under the carpet, nothing to see here?
Yeah, it could be a taboo. It could be, as in many cases, more senior police officers putting pressure on the junior ones not to investigate the case. it also could be down to personal prejudice, that they don't want to accept that SRA is real, and therefore they have a knee-jerk reaction of disbelieving that the Satanist elements of the case that has been revealed to them exists. I think in the Holy Grail case, it was more likely that there was a deliberate cover-up going on, that they had senior officers passing the message down: don't proceed with this investigation. We need to make sure it doesn't go any further. Attempts were made to silence the mother of Holly Gregg. So she was wrongfully and forcibly sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Thankfully, she managed to get an independent psychiatrist to assess her, who said that there was no signs of mental illness on her part, and so they were forced to release her. But the basic investigation method used by many police in the case of alleged child sex offenses is to check the computer. And they did not even, with just those 2 of the 22 suspects, they did not even bother to check their computers. They would probably have found on at least one of those computers, if they had checked them, child pornography, and could have arrested them on that basis, because obviously possession of child porn is a criminal offense in itself. And I believe they did it deliberately. They did it deliberately because they did not want to find any incriminating evidence on their computer. So this was what you could call a rookie mistake, but it's more likely a deliberate oversight of not checking their computers and only interviewing 2 of 22 suspects. So in those cases, you can see a very deliberate attempt by the police to basically make sure the investigation doesn't go any further. Even by the standards of the police, who sometimes just go through the motion so that they can say, oh, we investigated, but we found nothing. This is really taking it to the extreme of going through the motions in the Holly Gregg case. Another example will be the even larger SRA case. The 2 largest known SRA cases which have been covered up by the police are the Holly Gregg case, at least in the UK anyway, and the Hampstead SRA case. And in the Hampstead SRA case, the police only investigated for about 2 weeks before shutting it down and claiming that there wasn't enough evidence. Now, with such serious allegations that were made by the 2 children in the Hampstead SRA case, it would be common practice by the police to investigate it for at least much longer than 2 weeks, at least a month or more, before they shut it down if there isn't enough evidence. But they were in such a hurry to shut it down and to say to people, no worries, there's no SRA here. What the children said on YouTube, which was seen by about 4 million people, I understand, about the satanic elements of the case is untrue. And if you compare their statements when they talked about the ritual abuse that they suffered, and you see their retraction when the police officer interviewed them and they were retracting their statements, you can see from their body language, the way they speak about it, that they are far more truthful and relaxed when they're talking about the SRA that they suffered as being real than when they're retracting their statement. When they're retracting their statement, they're very uneasy, uncomfortable, which is a sign that they're not really telling the truth about what they're saying. And obviously they had been pressured a lot probably made empty promises about being returned to their mother, I suspect, if they retracted their statements. But they were never returned to her. In fact, they were returned to the father, who in their original statements, which were shown on YouTube, they had said abused them. So here we have another blatant example of police aiding and abetting a cover-up of a big SRA case. This doesn't mean that police will never investigate an SRA case. As you probably know, I have a list of 10 successfully prosecuted SRA cases in the UK that I use to show that SRA is a real problem in the UK. If it wasn't an imaginary issue, you will not have the Crown Courts having 10 successful convicted cases, at least 10 on SRA, where the SRA was openly shared in the court and where the witnesses for the prosecution who talked about the SRA were believed and accepted. Otherwise, the defendants would not have been convicted at all. So this is possible to convict and successfully prosecute Satanist ritual abusers. And it is important for SRA survivors to bring their cases to the police. Not all the police are necessarily going to cover up this issue. It depends on which particular police force is involved. But it's important to remember also that if you're bringing an SRA case to the police, it would help if you can, before you do that, get some support from your constituency MP and get your MP, if possible, to write to the Chief Constable in support of your case and urge a thorough investigation of your case, because it's normally from the top down that the pressure starts to cover up a case within the police, if it is covered up. So you're kind of preempting that by going to the top man for that particular police force and saying, you know, I'm watching this case, I'm concerned about it, I hope you will help this person get justice. Then they realize, oh, we're not just dealing with an ordinary member of the public who has no influence, no power, is just an unknown or relatively unknown victim. We've got someone who's got their member of parliament behind them, and the police will take what that person has to say more seriously, and if necessary, get the parliamentarian to repeatedly write to the Chief Constable or try and get a meeting with the Chief Constable to sort out face-to-face why the police are not more thoroughly and fully investigating the SRA allegations. We need to hold the police much more closely accountable for their failure to investigate SRA, because their failure to investigate SRA in many cases is just making the problem worse. It's encouraging the Satanist abusers to expand their abuse and their torture of children, because they're sending a message to the Satanist abusers, well, you do what you want, we're not going to stop you.
Yeah, there's no consequences.
Yes, what you have is impunity. And I often point out that impunity is not just something that takes place in certain Latin American countries where, as we all have heard, there used to be death squads doing whatever they want against certain vulnerable groups of people. Impunity exists in our own backyard with SRA cases. And the moment they started covering up SRA cases rather than investigating them thoroughly and going after the abusers, the police threw the rule of law that this country used to enjoy out the window. And we're not going to get the rule of law back until we get SRA properly investigated, as is the job of the police to do. We're not asking something unreasonable from the police. We're asking them to do their jobs. And we, the public, who pay the police salaries, with our taxpayers' money, need to hold the police closely accountable. And as with any job, if you're not willing to do the job properly, you should resign. And we should demand the resignation of chief constables of police forces that are covering up SRA. Make sure that the higher-ups who are not doing their job and are perhaps behind the scenes encouraging the cover-up are under pressure to resign if they're not willing to do what they're there for, because they're not fit for purpose. Why are you, a chief constable, not making sure that some of the most vulnerable people in our society are having their allegations seriously taken? And the same goes for social services, people in government, anybody who is supposed to be a public servant, holding them accountable if they're not willing to help get justice for SRA survivors. And say, if you're not willing to do this, you should resign. And maybe even do a petition calling for people to sign that this person should go, this person should resign. Because there are too many people being paid by our taxpayers' money who are more than happy to cover up SRA or to close their ears to the pleas for help from the SRA victims.
And for the viewers who are just, I'd like to get into some of the cases that you have in front of you as well. But just before we get into that, just for viewers for the first time tuning in and basically don't know what the hell SRA is about or what it even stands for, can you just basically explain to them what SRA is and how do actual male or female get involved and caught up in this demonic abuse?
Yes, SRA is a brutal form of mistreatment that includes psychological, spiritual, physical, and sexual abuse. And it is targeted at children and vulnerable adults. It is done in the context of Satanist rituals, hence the name Satanist ritual abuse. And it is usually done repeatedly over a long period of time, not simply as a one-off incident, which means for the poor victim, they have to go through years of suffering and nightmare and trauma until, if they survive, they come out at the other end. And then there'll be years of therapy needed to, in the case where they have DID, to reintegrate their personality, to help them heal, to help them to function in society with all the things that adults have to do for themselves, like getting a job, earning a living. Very difficult if they have been through SRA. Some manage to do it, a lot don't. It takes years, a process of healing. Part of that healing process is to be believed and to have the police take their allegations seriously and to have the police apprehend their abusers and have them convicted successfully in courts. That gives them healing as well. But that also helps to protect other children from SRA. SRA is horrific. What I've just described is just a pretty euphemistic, in a way, description, but it's an accurate description of what SRA is. If you want to get down to the nitty-gritty, we're talking about sex abuse and torture of children. The torture will include hanging them from hooks, beating them, drowning or suffocating them by other means, burying them under the ground in a coffin without them knowing if you're ever going to remove them from under the ground. Electric shocks are quite common, electrocutions. Sometimes forcing them to see the most horrific things. For example, a beloved family member being killed in front of them, or a beloved pet being killed in front of them. Satanists would sometimes encourage the child to build a close bond with their pet and then force the child to kill their own pet. they know it really messes their mind, so they do that intentionally. They also will do things like forcing children to sexually abuse each other to get them used to this concept that Satanists have of any form of sex is acceptable, including, of course, in their view, sex between adults and children. As long as you enjoy it, just do it. It goes back to the core belief of Satanists, which is do whatever you want. Doesn't matter who you hurt, doesn't matter who you mess up, just do whatever you want to get the satisfaction you want. It's the ultimate in selfishness. Not that there isn't enough selfishness in the world as it is, but that's all they have to offer the world is extreme selfishness. And acting on that selfishness means hurting a hell of a lot of people without caring anything about the consequences for those victims. Ritual sacrifice of animals, ritual sacrifice of humans. Sometimes they will force the child to participate in the ritual sacrifice of a person, and the child doesn't have the strength to push the dagger into the victim, so they put their hand over the child's hand to help them force it in. This is also to make the child feel guilty that they have been part of the evil that they've seen. And this also is another tool that they use to mess up the child's mind and to say to them, oh, well, if you want to expose us, don't forget you yourself have done bad things. You yourself have done evil. You participated in the sacrifice of this person. You helped to kill this person. Forcing the child to take part in cannibalism. Cannibalism is quite common in Satanist covens. They would normally eat the sacrificial victim. So in cases where they do cannibalism, they will cut up the body and pass the body parts around to be eaten. And the child will be forced to participate in that. Sometimes it's an animal. And I know, for example, in the Holly Gregg case, she saw a dog being ritually sacrificed. In addition, on another occasion, to a human being ritually sacrificed, an adult. And she was forced to eat the adult's flesh after the sacrifice, as well as eating the dog's flesh after the animal was sacrificed. So all this, you can imagine what horrors the child is going through. That's why I always say to people, look, you may feel uncomfortable. This is dark for you. This is uncomfortable for you. Maybe you feel frightened. But that is chicken feed compared to what the child feels. If you as an adult feel frightened, what do you think the child feels when they're going through this, when they're just, 5 years old, 4 years old, or even younger? Through all these horrors that I've been mentioning and describing to you.
And why the kids? I mean, to a Satanist, does it matter if it's a male or a female, or do they see the male more dominant than the female, or it doesn't matter just so long as it's a child?
Sometimes they have certain preferences on certain dates of the year, dates which are significant to the Satanist calendar. On certain dates of the year, there may be a preference for a male or female child. Sometimes on certain dates, it would not matter whether it's a male or female child. Or sometimes it may be emphasizing that it should be a female child or a male child, or maybe even an adult for certain sacrificial dates. It just depends on the date of the particular ritual. They also feel that they will get power by sacrificing these people. They are driven by power. Satanism is basically driven by the ruthless and relentless pursuit of power. Power over people. They hunger for power over people. They hunger for more and more money. Satanists are always on the lookout for ways to make lots of money. So they get involved, for example, quite commonly in pimping out their own children to pedophiles. So these pedophiles may have nothing to do with following Satanism or SRA, but they will pay good money to the Satanists for letting them have access to children to be sexually abused by them. This is part of their mentality, and they will also get involved in other illegal activities like child trafficking or drug trafficking to make more money, because for them money is also power, and they are always on the lookout for making a profit as well as victimizing the vulnerable. And they believe that they can feed off the trauma and the despair of their victims, feed off it to give themselves more power and energy, and please the devil whom they worship, who they believe will then reward them for all these awful things they've done. And so we have this very twisted belief system that tries to make good, what any decent person will recognize as good, appear evil. It's evil to them, and they try to teach children that good is evil and believe that evil is good. So children who've been indoctrinated by Satanists will have an upside down system of values where they're taught that it's good to abuse a child. It's good to victimize other people. It's good to even kill others. It's bad to be good to another person. It's bad to care about them. It's bad to be compassionate towards them. It's bad to love them, to care about them. Complete inversion, upside down. And in a way, that can be symbolized by the upside down cross, which Satanists sometimes hide in plain sight. One example is if you go to around the boundaries of the City of London, including near London Bridge, you will see the small dragon that is a symbol of the City of London, holding an upside down shield. Now, this upside down shield has a cross on it. So the cross on the shield is upside down as well. And it's hidden in plain sight. Thousands of people walk past that every day. I don't think perhaps less than 5 of them or any of them notice that this is a very satanic symbol hidden in plain sight in bright red colors, and nobody really understands the significance of this, because this is the City of London. This is one of the financial districts of the world, and you've got satanic symbols planted around the City of London, and somebody's got to ask why. Well, Satanists go to where the money is, and what better place in terms of money to go to than the City of London? Power, influence, that's where they're headed. So they will head to government, they will head to parliament, they will head to police, social services, people who have power over others. It's all a very ruthless and relentless pursuit of power and wanting to enslave people. Satanism is about enslaving others. Having your satisfaction, your self-indulgence, your enjoyment at the expense of others, not even caring what others think or how it affects others, but also having power over others. One example of having power over others is that sometimes the Satanist abusers will even brand, like cattle, branding cattle, brand their victims with a branding iron to show the victims that they belong to the Satanists who are abusing them. they are, if they get what they want, the Satanist New World Order, they are going to be enslaving a lot of people across the world. They have this objective to set up a new order, a new world order that will fit in with their global agenda to control people across the world, impose Satanist control. But they're not doing it by the old-fashioned way, as Hitler tried, of invading other countries, military invasion, or as Napoleon tried, or Alexander the Great tried. None of them ever managed to control the world 100%. And the Satanists have a more sophisticated way of doing this, which is create circumstances which encourage people to compromise their national sovereignty in order, for example, to deal with major global crises, such as the so-called climate change crisis and the so-called COVID-19 pandemic. Get people scared out of their minds over these global crises so that they're willing to compromise their freedoms and their national sovereignty in the interest of dealing with these threatening global crises. And I think that is one of the reasons why we are looking at exaggerated COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not saying COVID-19 doesn't exist. I believe it does exist to some extent, but nothing as big as is being presented to us, because there are various reports of grossly exaggerated numbers. We know that the UK, for example, had to climb down from the original figure of likely 200,000 dying from COVID-19, and they had to do a big climb down from that. Very clear example of scaremongering. And we also know that there are cases of the numbers being jacked up by including people who did not die from COVID-19, but died with COVID-19. So that was not the real cause of death. They just happened to have COVID-19 when they died. They died from something else. But yet they're still added to the statistics of fatalities from COVID-19 to inflate the numbers so that the government has more justification to say, well, you know, we need more restrictions, we need more controls over your movements, your behavior, because this is a big problem and it keeps coming back, and so on and so forth. And in January 2019, I interviewed an SRA survivor who was very unusual in the sense that he was the first SRA survivor I met in the UK, who not only had been subjected to SRA as a child, but had also had medical experiments done on him. And he even showed me some of the medical research labs, which are still being used today, that were used to experiment on him when he was a boy. And all those experiments were focused on infectious diseases. And I asked him, were they looking to find a way to create a very effective infectious disease, a man-made infectious disease? And were they looking to find a vaccine for this infectious disease? Not out of altruistic reasons, but just so they could have leverage over the population who was exposed to this disease, because the population would be begging them to share that vaccine with them. And of course, the Satanists would have loads of strings attached to that vaccine. So he replied to me, yes, for all these reasons, they did these experiments on him. That's what he believes. And it's a very interesting so-called coincidence that almost exactly 1 year after I interviewed him and he shared all this information with me, we had the COVID-19 pandemic reach the UK. And now we see how effective it's been in controlling our lives, micromanaging our lives. We're probably going to see more to come. They're not only doing that, they're also using it as a justification to call for one world government. Gordon Brown, the former UK Prime Minister, has publicly said he wants to see one world government to deal with the COVID-19 crises and other global crises like this. We have the globalists seeing this as their big chance to go for what is ultimately the globalists, the logical conclusion of globalism, which is one world government. So we can see the fingerprints of the involvement of the Satanists, who are certainly milking it for all it's worth. This COVID-19 pandemic and the response to it is being milked for all it's worth by the Satanists because it's advancing their agenda. And one very clear example of this was around the summer solstice in June this year. Satanist groups in different countries were organizing rallies, very clearly calling for the establishment of one world government. They saw their chance and they grabbed it, and they were making a public call for one world government. Fortunately, they don't seem to have a lot of public support at the moment for that call. But if the public gets scared enough, well, maybe one day soon they will. The one world government approach, as I said earlier, is more sophisticated than the approach of, well, let's dominate the world by invading all the countries. No, that doesn't work. Historically, it's been tried over and over again without success. So what they're trying is to convince the world they need one world government. Convince the world this is in your interest to deal with pandemics, to deal with climate change, crises, inverted commas, and whatever other global crises they manage to manufacture in future. You need one world government to deal with this, to protect yourself, to protect your life, to protect the life of your loved ones, etc., so that people willingly sign up and sign away their freedoms and their national sovereignty to the globalist agenda. Then the next step is for them to put at the top of that one world government the leader of it, who will be the person that the Christians refer to and the Bible refers to as the Antichrist. The Satanists will regard this person as some kind of savior, and unfortunately, a lot of the world will be hoodwinked into believing that this person is some kind of savior for them. And so the Satanists, who have a lot of influence in the mainstream media, will sell him as a great savior for the world. First, you get the world into a great panic over their lives and their security, and then you present them with the savior, which will be the one world government, and the savior at the top of it, who will lead the one world government to save the world, who in reality will be the Antichrist. As in Nazi Germany, where a lot of German people voted Hitler into power and saw him as the savior of the nation, bearing in mind that he was actually democratically elected into power. Not a good reflection on democracy. Of course, he did away with all the democratic processes after he got into power, but he actually got voted into power because people were really scared. Their livelihoods were seriously threatened. There was a huge economic crisis in Germany, and Hitler managed to, at least at the beginning, bring some real economic relief to the country and development and order out of the chaos in the country. And so will probably be the case with the Antichrist when he comes to power, that people will think he's some great savior and he'll do some very impressive things to bring peace and order and stop wars, prevent wars. And people will think he's a man of peace. But eventually, as eventually happened with Hitler in Germany, they will catch on that, well, he's not what we originally thought. He is actually the opposite of what we originally thought he was.
Well, the devil is the greatest deceiver.
Exactly. So be careful of these false saviors, such as the coming Antichrist. Be careful of one world government. Be careful of globalism, which is being pushed as being some kind of solution to the world's problems. Lots of influential politicians today are globalists, including Tony Blair, the Clintons, Barack Obama, for example, and of course that very rich person who's bankrolling a lot of this agenda, George Soros. The very clear anti-globalist who's in an influential position and who the Satanists are desperately trying to remove from office, at least partly due to his anti-globalist stance, is Donald Trump. You don't have to agree with all his policies, but I think it's no big secret that he's anti-globalist, and it's no big secret that globalism is going to lead us down the road to being dominated and enslaved by the Satanists. So as a matter of logic, you want to be supporting the politicians who are anti-globalist. Even if you strongly disagree with some of the other policies. I mean, nobody agrees with all the policies of a politician anyway. So we need to have some streetwise approach here to strengthening and supporting those politicians who help obstruct the globalist agenda. Because this is such a huge part of the Satanist agenda. And the European Union has been a model for globalism. Globalism is like the European Union writ large. It is a model for the world, how the Satanists would like the world to be, is the EU. And I interviewed a couple of years ago a former Satanist leader who used to work with top Satanist leaders for international Satanism. And she said to me, in no uncertain terms, the EU is dominated and controlled by Satanists. And she had even seen a 3-time EU commissioner at the Satanist rituals that she was at, including other people as well, like Edward Heath, Cyril Smith, Leon Britton, just to name a few of the so-called VIPs that she came across at the Satanist rituals. And I asked her, was the EU good at the beginning, then hijacked by the Satanists? And she made it very clear. She said, no, the EU was Satanist right from the beginning.
And so, still to this day, you believe it's thoroughly infiltrated with it?
Still to this day, I will believe her statement that the EU is controlled and dominated by Satanists. And I knew when I saw the referendum results for Brexit, which I was all in favor of, that there was going to be a huge fight ahead for Britain to get out. But I'm glad to say, of course, eventually, after a long fight, Britain did get out of the EU. But if you want to ask why the Satanists would want a COVID-19 pandemic at this point of time, I believe one of the reasons is mess up Britain's economy. Because if the UK succeeds economically outside the EU, many more current members of the EU will be tempted to leave, because they will think that if Britain can prosper just as much outside the EU as in the EU, why don't we follow suit at least then we won't have to pay the EU all these large amounts of money that they demand from us, or take in these quotas of foreign refugees that they expect us to take in. We won't have all these rules and regulations. We can just make as much money ourselves, because one of the greatest incentives the EU has presented for other countries to join them and to stay in the EU is economic. But that will all be disproved if the UK can prosper just as much outside the EU as they did in the EU, or even more outside the EU. But when Britain has just got out of Brexit, got out of the EU, lo and behold, we get hit with the pandemic. And that, of course, puts a huge dent in the UK economy. That, and also very interesting timing, the attempt by the Satanists, I believe, to impeach Trump and get him out of the White House failed. And shortly after that, we had COVID-19 pandemic. They are desperate to remove him from the White House. He's not only a globalist, which is a big obstacle to their globalist agenda, and certainly will not go along with a one world government. He's also, according to the leading activist on child trafficking in the United States, named Jaco Booyens. His name is spelled Jaco, B for Bravo, Ooyens. You can Google him, look him up. He's on the internet and also on YouTube as saying that President Trump has done more than any previous US president to fight child trafficking, and has been more successful than any previous president, and also more successful than any world leader currently existing in fighting child trafficking. That's a huge compliment for Trump. And it's coming from an independent third party who's very experienced in this area. And we know that the Satanists depend a lot on child trafficking for their supply of victims. Yes, they also use other methods like brood mares, women forced to become pregnant and give birth to babies who are not officially on the record, so they can be ritually sacrificed without anybody knowing. But in terms of volume, you got to ask yourself, for example, in the Hampstead SRA case, what the two children revealed about the sheer number of toddlers and babies being sacrificed by that coven, they had to be closely linked to child trafficking to get such a big number of victims on a regular basis. So by being so effective in combating child trafficking, Trump has put another dent in the Satanist agenda. So it's not surprising that they're so desperate to get rid of him. So they want to achieve multiple objectives, as they often do with their actions, which is mess up the UK economy so that other countries won't be tempted to leave the EU, mess up Donald Trump's economic success in the US so that he loses lots of votes and hopefully will lose the November election this year. And the timing of this all is very interesting, that this all blew up shortly after the failed impeachment attempt against Trump, and after the UK finally managed to implement Brexit. So I don't think this is a mere coincidence. I think there is a number of objectives involved here, which all benefit the Satanists, that result from this COVID-19 pandemic. And there's more to come. And they can, of course, jack up the numbers of people who supposedly have COVID-19 whenever they want to bring back restrictions or increase restrictions on us. And they will probably do so, I believe. And we have to stand up for our freedoms. Freedom is something that if you don't use it to fight, to preserve it, then you're just going to lose the freedom. you can't just stand there passively. But in order to do this, you have to understand what is the threat to our freedoms now. And I always say that you need to expose SRA first and foremost. Because once you expose SRA and the reality of SRA, then it leads you on to the bigger picture of what the Satanists are doing. Because SRA is a very good start due to the fact that it shows us the true nature of Satanism. You know, they try and give us a kind of whitewashed version of Satanism. This is all just bull. The real heart of Satanism, it's enslavement of people, it's torture of people, it's killing of people. As I often like to point out, Satanism is about serial killing, serial torture, serial sex abuse, and yet they want to be a respected religion. I don't think they are a real religion. If you recognize them as a real religion, it's like letting the Yorkshire Ripper invent his own religion. You can't allow that. You can't give that the respectability of being a religion. And so we have to expose SRA and Satanism for what it actually is by speaking out openly, by getting the message out. People who are watching interviews like this can help a lot by sharing these interviews and the links to these interviews with their contacts, their friends, putting it on their social media accounts, if they have social media accounts, and then encouraging their friends in turn to share it with their contacts as well. And so it moves out like ripples, unending ripples of information about SRA throughout society. And that's the way to get the message out, because we're not getting much, if any, help from the mainstream media. So the best alternative way to get the message out is through social media, through the internet, by word of mouth, putting it on your social media platforms. At the present time, we still have enough freedom to do this. So let's use the freedom while we still have it to get the message out.
Do you believe some of the mainstream are involved in Satanism, be it, you know, newspapers, TV channels? Do you believe there's a certain amount of infiltration in there as well?
Yes, in fact, I know of some mainstream publications that have been heavily infiltrated by Satanists. I could name names. I'm not going to name them now, but I could name names of Satanist journalists, Satanist-controlled publications who are regarded as mainstream media, who I wouldn't touch with a barge pole if I was trying to expose SRA. Take note if you see a certain journalist who repeatedly over a long period of time keeps rubbishing the existence of SRA. That is a telltale sign of what their real agenda is. We're not talking about objective journalism here. We're talking about an agenda to cover up SRA. Not surprising that the Satanists would infiltrate the media. They know how much power and influence the media has, and they will always infiltrate any group that has power and influence, which of course will include the mainstream media. They have also sometimes infiltrated the alternative media. No media is 100% foolproof from infiltration by the Satanists. They also set up their own websites without mentioning that they are Satanist websites on the internet, making claims that SRA doesn't exist, making claims that people like myself who are publicly exposing SRA are all wrong, are making all these terrible mistakes, are such terribly misguided people, etc., and on and on and on. This is all part of their strategy. Unfortunately, there are always gullible people who will take those kind of indoctrination at face value and not look at the alternative views on this issue, who then just very impulsively, as a knee-jerk reaction, repeat what they have been indoctrinated with, the old lie that SRA doesn't exist. Of course it exists. Look at the evidence, for goodness sake. nobody can deny what the police themselves have publicly acknowledged, what the courts themselves have found to be credible. Who are you to deny that? You must be living on another planet to deny the truth of that. And if you don't believe it, go and look at the court records yourself about these SRA cases that have been successfully prosecuted. So the issue comes back to, we've got the evidence. It's not a question of lack of evidence. We've got the evidence. The problem is either that the person who keeps trying to deny SRA exists is himself or herself a Satanist, but of course it's not going to admit that. And their job is to just keep trying to influence people with the old lie that SRA does not exist. Or that person is suffering from cognitive dissonance, and whatever evidence you give them, they can't handle the truth. So they will always keep denying it because they can't cope with the truth. They can't cope with the fact that such evil exists in their own society, and they probably had a very rosy picture, or relatively more rosy picture of their society, which they are not willing to modify in the face of evidence. People like this are usually basically just believe what they want to believe, and they don't really care about the evidence. So you can put piles of evidence in front of them, they're just going to keep on denying that SRA exists. They are useful pawns for the Satanists to manipulate and use, but they are no use to exposing SRA. In fact, they're more of a hindrance. The best you can expect from such people is that they just stay out of it and don't repeat their skepticism to others. Because what is at stake here is the protection of children from the most horrific torture and sex abuse, from having their lives ruined by such torture and sex abuse. Doesn't mean they can't recover and build a good life for themselves in future, but it's going to take years to do that in most cases. The damage is so horrific that it's always far better to prevent it happening in the first place, if you can, by exposing SRA. The more SRA gets exposed, the more pressure put on the authorities to put away the abusers, and we can only stop them if we put them away behind bars. The only other way they're going to stop is if they leave Satanism, which sometimes happens, and I've met ex-Satanists who've left the covens and left SRA behind them, but it's very rare.
How difficult is that? Is it sort of like a blood in, blood out situation that you become a Satanist, and then it's almost impossible for you to leave it in later life?
It's difficult. It's not easy for them to leave. The three ex-Satanists I know who, in the UK, who left Satanism, all became Christians. Not necessarily became Christians first, then left, but were probably headed in that direction before they left and converted not long after they left Satanism. Not easy. None of them, I think, would say it was easy, but they kept persisting and managed to get out. One of them, I think, is still, to some extent, being monitored by her Satanist coven because they're afraid of what she will expose, and they want to let her know that they're still watching. But she basically is, in most cases, just left alone to get on with her life. Some people who try to leave the covens will probably face death threats, threats to harm them in other ways, and a lot of pressure to stay. I know of an SRA survivor who is still being harassed by her coven, but avoids going back to coven meetings, even though if they have a chance, they will literally drag her to a coven meeting. But so far, with the help of support from others, she has been able to stay away for quite a long time from attending a coven meeting.
And when you say coven meeting, for people that are clueless to this, what do you mean by that? Is it once a week they have to do this, or once a month? I mean, is there certain gatherings and times that these Satanists basically gather?
Different covens have different times and regularity for their meetings. Yes, there are certain significant dates on the calendar that they will observe wherever they are. The most well-known one and probably most important one for them is Halloween, 31st October. But they also meet on the birth dates of their members. They do put a lot of emphasis on birthdays because they see themselves as also becoming gods. You know, 666 means man as God. Man becomes God is represented by 666. That's why it's such an important number for the Antichrist and for his followers, the Satanists. The Satanists are the foot soldiers of the coming Antichrist. The Satanists are paving the way. In fact, I asked that former Satanist leader, were you and your colleagues, your fellow Satanists, preparing for the coming of the Antichrist, for the rise of the Antichrist? And immediately she said yes. And the way she said it so firmly was in such a way as if she was saying to me, of course, that's our job description. Of course, that's what we do. We are Satanists. So make no mistake, just as the Nazis had their stormtroopers and their SS, the Antichrist has his Satanist followers who are not only going to pave the way for his rise to power, which is why there were Satanists in different countries around summer solstice this year, all calling for one world government, openly calling for it, paving the way for the rise of the Antichrist. But they will also enforce, after his rise, his rules, his very draconian rules over people around the world will be enforced by the Satanists. So do not underestimate what the Satanists are doing or what they are preparing the world for and what they are going to put the world through. And this makes the Satanists even worse in many ways than the Nazis. And even more important than fighting the Nazis is to fight these people. So sometimes I call this World War III. But it's not about the Nazis being at the gate and needing to be held off at the gate. The Nazis are in our society, spread throughout it, holding influential positions. They're well within the gate, and in some cases leading our society. And we need to challenge them, expose them, exposure of what they're doing, exposure of SRA, whether they're VIPs or not, is a key weapon we have. Exposing them on alternative media, pushing the authorities to investigate SRA, all these are key weapons. We're not only helping to protect children from SRA, we're helping ourselves to be protected from enslavement if we do this. We can do something now, it's not too late yet, to stop being enslaved by the Satanists, at least in our generation. After we're gone, well, it's up to the next one, the next generation, to defend their freedoms from the Satanists. But if we don't succeed, if we don't bother to fight, then there's a huge amount of trouble and enslavement waiting for us down the road. And we will have no one but ourselves to blame for ending up under their control, because we were warned, we did see the signs coming, but we chose to ignore them because we were too lazy, too fearful, too unwilling to face up to the evidence, too unwilling to heed the warnings, simply as a knee-jerk reaction, dismissed it mistakenly as conspiracy theory. Well, we're talking conspiracy facts here. Because people do, in reality, conspire to do evil.
Yeah.
And in the law, there are actual offenses like conspiracy to commit murder, for example, with the word conspiracy in them, because the law recognizes that people do conspire to do evil. And when the Nazis were put on trial, they were one of the offenses they were charged with at the Nuremberg trials was conspiracy to commit war. And of course, we know that Churchill warned against the conspiracies of the Nazis before they started invading other European countries. But most people didn't want to listen to Churchill's warnings. He was probably labeled as a conspiracy theorist in his time. But eventually he was vindicated by what happened when the Nazis started to invade and conquer other countries. But it was nearly too late to do anything about it. And if Britain had lost the war against the Nazis, then it would have been too late. Fortunately, they didn't lose by the skin of their teeth. They managed to win the Battle of Britain. But imagine the price they would have paid for not taking Churchill's warnings seriously and simply dismissing it probably as the conspiracy theories of a fringe politician. Do we learn from history? Do we ever learn from these mistakes of the past? Or are we condemned to just repeat them? And of course, we are not facing literal Nazis now, although it's interesting to point out that some Satanist covens are emphasizing Nazism in their beliefs.
And is there such thing as a satanic manual? Or when these people say if they go to rituals in a forest or they gather once a week, once a month, do they actually have a manual to basically go from? And this is the rules and regulations or their so-called Bible that they basically infiltrate out to others and a script to go from?
My understanding is that different Satanist covens have different emphases in terms of what particular belief system they want to focus a lot of their practices on. So some Satanist covens will emphasize, as in the Kidwelly case, they emphasize Egyptian magic and they emphasize Aleister Crowley. Other Satanist covens, as was reported last year in the Daily Telegraph, emphasize Nazism. And there apparently is a growth in Satanist covens in the UK emphasizing Nazism. Some Satanist covens will emphasize Greek witchcraft and worship certain Greek so-called gods or goddesses connected to Greek witchcraft. Other Satanist covens may emphasize Babylonian magic, and others focus on Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism in their practices. But they do have a lot of things in common, although they may have different emphases, which is a bit like, as a rough analogy, the church having different denominations, for example. They will have the common objective of, for example, one world government, rule of the Antichrist. They are not just disparate covens doing their own thing, not caring what the bigger international goal of Satanism is. No, they do liaise with one another and cooperate with one another for the big international goals, which will include the one world government, and at the top of that one world government, the Antichrist, who will be their satanic, so-called great satanic savior, and will be seen as a savior by a lot of the world, who will foolishly agree to have the mark of the beast, as said in the Bible, the 666 symbol, put on their forehead and put on their forearm in order to buy and sell. And this comes back to another point of the COVID-19 pandemic, the discouragement of the use of cash, which is paving the way for ultimately people only being allowed to use a credit card type chip to buy and sell. And of that chip, the Antichrist will want planted under people's foreheads or people's arms, and that will be the mark of the beast, the 666. And it will basically enslave the people who take that chip under their skin. And very disturbingly, some years ago, there was a trial in Sweden where a lot of people volunteered to have the chip implanted under their skin to buy and sell things like train tickets, and were singing its praises, saying how convenient it was to be able to not have to use cash, just use this chip, not knowing that they are paving the way for their own enslavement. And what they think is just some convenience for them is actually part of a bigger agenda that is to come in the not too distant future, of people not using cash anymore and only being able to buy and sell with these chips under their skin. So we are being pointed in the direction of only using such chips at the moment on our credit cards instead of cash because of COVID-19. I have found it a real radical change because I use cash to buy and sell things. I don't use credit card. And so it's quite clear to me where people are headed now. In the old days, before COVID-19, it was a question of asking, do you take credit cards? Now we have to ask, do you take cash? Because cash is the thing that's becoming more rare now. And we have to hold on to these old things, hold on to the use of cash, hold on to nationalism, not violent nationalism. You can have peaceful nationalism. If we want to block the process of the globalist, satanist New World Order, if we want to put obstacles in that way, hold on to your cash, hold on to nationalist beliefs. It was nationalism that helped to get the UK out of the EU. And thank goodness for that. Let's build on that to also obstruct the globalist agenda in other ways. And one more thing about the EU, about a year after the former Satanist leader revealed to me about Satanists controlling the EU, there was a Belgian mayor by the name of Wilfred Wong who confided in a friend that he was about to expose a huge scandal in the EU that involved Satanism, and it would rock Europe to its core once he exposed it. And he also indicated that it involved child abuse. Unfortunately for him, and I believe for us, he never got to do his big expose because he was murdered before he could do it. And no one has caught his murderer, and no one has been able to reveal, at least publicly, what he was trying to expose and going to expose before he was murdered. But he was saying exactly what this Satanist, ex-Satanist leader was saying to me, that there were leaders in the EU involved in these very dark things. And he was also pointing out that the EU puts on a very sort of compassionate face, but it's all false. It's all untrue. It's all just a facade. And he was going to expose that. Unfortunately, he was killed before he could do that. Lots of questions need to be asked about that. We need someone to expose this for the sake of the other countries which are still in the EU. The EU, as has often been complained and used as one of the reasons why the UK got out of the EU, is a very opaque organization with little transparency and accountability. And this fits in perfectly with the Satanist way of doing things, which is always secrecy, deception, lack of accountability. So we've earlier mentioned police cover-ups, social services cover-ups, and they're all lacking transparency and lacking accountability. They often hide behind secrecy, secret family courts, where the children are handed over to the custody of the abusive parents. Oh, you can't mention the names publicly of the abusive parent, of the children, for the sake of the children. That's the excuse they use for the secrecy. Yeah. So secrecy can be legitimate when it's genuinely needed, but it's often used to hide the Satanist activities and also to hide incompetence. And this is very dangerous. And we have that secrecy with the EU, and that only benefits the Satanists. Hopefully other countries will see the UK eventually prospering outside the EU and following in their footsteps. The other thing about creating an economic crisis is that it makes people more open to a dictatorial, inverted commas, savior rising to power, just as the economic crisis in Germany made them open to Hitler. And people are now being conditioned for such a savior, a false savior, to come and offer the masses a solution to their problems, that he will lead the way for them. And people will be conditioned to support such a savior. We've had people like that in the not too distant past being offered to us. And in many of these cases, the people will simply follow the mainstream media blindly. They will not look below the surface. They will not do their own research on these people or look at the actual results of their leadership. All you need nowadays, it seems, is someone who can speak well, have some charisma, have a great PR machine behind them, have the mainstream media behind them, and loads of the public will fall hook, line, and sinker for these false messiahs, for these leaders. Interesting to note in the Bible that Jesus himself warned that there will be many messiahs, some who will come in his name, so-called messiahs, before his return. And the world is being prepared for this by the crises and perceived crises that it's being presented with. And so people are ripe for a false messiah to come along and give them the solutions they're longing for, whether it's the pandemic, the climate change crisis, or against Islamic extremism, war, terrorism, whatever. People are looking for a savior, and they're looking in the wrong places, and many of them will be taken in by this false messiah. Just as people were desperate for a savior in Germany after the First World War, and along came Hitler. So we must be vigilant, I believe. We must expose SRA in order to expose the wider agenda. And I want to read the warning by one of the earlier campaigners on SRA in the UK, whose name is Diane Corr. And she wrote a book that was published in 1991 on SRA entitled Chasing Satan. And at page 13 of her book, she gave this very prophetic warning. This was as far back as 1991. She wrote, but there is also a unique cultural dimension to satanic crime. The perpetrators want to change society, whereas the pedophile is interested only in satisfying his lusts and otherwise wishes the world to continue as it is. The Satanist wants to undermine the institutions and morality of society. In a democracy, they are entitled to pursue such goals. so long as they have the guts to openly declare their objectives. But they are cowards who lurk in dark corners, determined to engineer their objectives secretly. And that's what they've been doing. Can you imagine, back in 1991, they were at work doing this, how far they've advanced, because nobody has exposed SRA, has exposed their bigger, wider agenda.
That's what I was going to ask you, since you started looking into it in the early 90s, you know, how far do you think it's advanced globally? It's pretty big in England, but globally, how is there hope for us?
I think there's still hope, but time is running out and we need to act now, and we need to act decisively. And there is a way to expose Satanism, SRA, challenge the global Satanist agenda, but we need to be willing to act and willing to put our actions where our beliefs are. I come across too many people who express good intentions about doing something about SRA, but when it comes to actually doing it, they get cold feet, they get second thoughts, they pull out. Now that's not going to do anything, that's not going to achieve anything. As with World War II, in this war, unless you're willing to put in energy, put in time, act smart, as in work smart and work hard to oppose this evil agenda, we're not going to win. We're not going to stop them.
Do you believe it's a spiritual war?
Definitely. It is both a spiritual war and a physical war. It's not enough just to pray. We must pray. We have to pray. And I would add fast as well. I pray and fast against Satanism and SRA regularly. But I know also that's not enough. You also have to work hard in the physical realm and work smart. It's not enough to work hard. It's not enough to have good intentions. You have to be streetwise in what you do. I've come across too many people with good intentions who are quite naive about how Satanists infiltrate those who oppose them. So they let their guard down and they let anybody who expresses an intention to help in, only to find out later that they've been infiltrated by Satanists. I know, for example, on the Holy Greg campaign for justice for Holy Greg, that at least 3 times they were infiltrated by Satanists. Minimum 3 times. They didn't learn from the first infiltration, so they got infiltrated the second time, then they got infiltrated the third time. Satanists must have been thinking, wow, this is so easy. You know, this is a cakewalk to infiltrate these people. That's why I say it's not enough just to have good intentions. You've got to be vigilant to infiltration. You've got to understand your enemy. If you understand your enemy and understand yourself, then you're much more likely to win. And you've got to understand that Satanists are very good at acting, very good at infiltration, very good at appearing to want to help, but are actually there to infiltrate. Now, I'm not saying that you'll be paranoid about everybody who wants to help. Of course, there will be genuine people. Most of them will be genuine, but you've got to be on the lookout for those who are not genuine. One of the signs of those who are not genuine, which they may show at the beginning of their infiltration or after you've accepted them, is this encouragement to drop the word Satanist from Satanist ritual abuse, because they feel so threatened when you name them. It's like putting them in front of the spotlight and exposing their dark deeds to a very bright light when you name Satanists in the Satanist ritual abuse. No, they prefer you to just call it ritual abuse or some other rather lame phrase, as long as you leave the word Satanist out. And I've actually met a Satanist infiltrator who spent some time trying to persuade me to drop the word Satanist from Satanist ritual abuse. And I was thinking to myself, now I know what really scares you people. Now I know what
is the
we
exposure
need to be doing more of. We need to be going in the opposite direction. to really expose the Satanists. And you will have noticed that those people like myself, like John Wedger, who have been talking openly about Satanist ritual abuse, not ritual abuse, but Satanist ritual abuse, very openly, very repeatedly. We are reaching the public with the message, much more so than the people who just talk about ritual abuse, who kind of almost apologize for talking about these issues, who kind of pussyfoot around the issues, instead of just telling it directly and openly and letting the SRA survivors have a platform to talk about it. And they talk about SRA openly and publicly. We're getting the most public response and public interest on this subject, more so than those who for years and years have been going on about ritual abuse, drop the word Satanist. And this is because if you want people to understand the subject, you've got to go to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is Satanism. Without Satanism, there would be no Satanist ritual abuse. Satanism feeds and perpetuates Satanist ritual abuse. And it scares the daylights out of them when you talk about that and when you mention it publicly.
And what has been the kickback or threats or abuse maybe you've gotten over the years for basically exposing this so bluntly and not hiding behind the shadows yourself, just coming openly and honestly out, talking about this no matter what the consequence?
There has been some kickback, but I couldn't care less. Because if you want to win a war, you have to stick your head above the parapet. You have to be forthright about who the enemy is, what the enemy is up to. Otherwise, people don't really understand what on earth you're talking about. It's hard enough for people to get their head around SRA. If you start hiding the Satanist elements, it makes it even more complicated and less likely they'll understand it. If they don't understand it, they're not going to support you. They're not going to get behind you. So make it plain, tell it like it is, call it what it is, and don't give a damn about what the Satanists think or what they complain about or whatever they try and do to stop you. That has always been my policy. I couldn't care less what they think. Why should I care what people who torture and abuse children think? I couldn't care less. Why should I give weight to what they think by responding to them? I couldn't care less. You know, I'm going to carry on and I'm going to keep on doing the job of exposing this, regardless of what the backlash is. And that has always been my attitude. I'll just step around the backlash. I'll just step over it. Or I'll use it against the Satanists to say, look, this just shows you how much cover-up is going on. Because if this was just about an honest difference of opinion about whether SRA exists, not a deliberate, systematic cover-up, they wouldn't be doing these things. But these people, they overreach themselves. They go way beyond just a disagreement with you, what you're saying about SRA existing. No, they're going way beyond that to shut you up permanently if they can, or discourage you from ever talking about it again. They are, in my view, they're a paper tiger. They can't do as much as what people think they can do. They are not as dangerous as people think they are. I'm not saying there's no danger. There is some, but if we all rise up and speak out, then there is security in numbers. And you can do it as a voice in the desert on this subject, as I have been for several years, and still continue to do it. As I have pointed out in some other interviews, I have done it for many years. And look, I'm still bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I can still keep going. I'm not some kind of emotional wreck or physical wreck because of what I've been doing. Of course, God has been helping me all the way, and God will continue to help me because this is the job that He gave me to do. And I will do it come hell or high water, I will do it and I will continue doing it. And good eventually triumphs over evil. And this is a battle between good and evil. But good will triumph faster over evil if more people get behind the good. It's a basic truth of life. As long as humans have lived, this basic truth is good will eventually triumph over evil. Evil triumphs when good men do nothing, as Edmund Burke pointed out. And children are meant to be loved and nurtured and cherished, not simply left to the wolves to devour, as happens when we look the other way in the face of Satanist ritual abuse. And all adults have a responsibility for all children, at least in their society, if not globally. It is not just a matter for that children's parents, especially not if the parents themselves are doing SRA to their child, and for adults to look the other way and say, well, it's not my child, so I don't care. No, if you're an adult, if you're worthy of the name of being an adult, you also have a responsibility for all the children in your society, especially those who desperately need our help, need our support, need our protection. It's our responsibility. And we should all shoulder this collective responsibility with courage, with clarity, with conviction to expose SRA. Then we will be fulfilling our responsibilities as adults. Too many adults are not shouldering that responsibility, are ignoring it. If more adults were to take on this responsibility and understand that they have this duty to protect children, at least in their society, if not globally, then they will be doing a lot more against SRA, speaking out a lot more, writing to the MPs, writing to the media, participating in letter writing campaigns, participating in demonstrations. We need to be able to get people out on the streets to demonstrate on these issues. Look at the Belgians in the Marc Dutroux case, which had Satanist elements in it, bearing in mind that on one of the police raids in the Marc Dutroux investigations, they found a lot of Satanist paraphernalia in the house of the suspect. And Marc Dutroux himself said he could name big names involved in all this abuses against children, influential people. There's definitely a Satanist element involved in that case. And when a cover-up was attempted by getting rid of the investigating judge who was actually doing his job properly, more than 300,000 Belgians took to the streets, including the Belgian firemen who were aiming their water hoses at high pressure at the government offices, saying that they wanted to wash the government of their corruption. Imagine that. Imagine if our firemen got involved in these demonstrations. Great. That would be a wonderful press opportunity as well. And imagine the picture that would make in the newspapers. Great photo opportunity. Now, some of the people try to claim, especially the Satanists, that this made no difference. Of course, it made a huge difference. You have to be deaf, dumb, and blind to not know that it made a huge difference, because the investigating judge who was removed was reinstated after that protest. And on top of that, Marc Dutroux got a life imprisonment sentence, which is far more than most Satanist abusers in the UK ever get, life imprisonment. And he's still in prison. Yes, he's tried to get out early, but he's still in prison, and his efforts to get out so far have failed because they know that this is really going to upset the Belgian public. And who knows, they may take to the streets in the hundreds of thousands again if they try to let him out early from prison. They got the results because they showed people power. They bothered to show up. And bothering to show up for these demonstrations for justice had very clear and long-lasting results. We can learn from that, because We're so much larger, obviously, than Belgium in terms of population. They could get more than 300,000 out. We could get more than 600,000 or 1 million out on the streets. If we could be bothered about the protection of children from these unimaginable evils and horror that SRA inflicts on them, that the Satanists inflict on them. If we were doing peaceful demonstrations as frequently as, say, those groups that are rioting out in the US and have been rioting out in the US recently, and if we were as committed as they were to showing up, not to riot, but to do peaceful demonstrations on the regularity that they are doing their violent demonstrations out in the US, we will be moving very rapidly in forcing the government to deal with SRA. We need to show them the public wants results, wants action against SRA. The public is not going to put up with the evil status quo. They're not going to tolerate a few cosmetic changes here and there, which is all that we've got so far, so that business as usual can be carried on, which means abuse as usual as well of the children. But to do that, we must be willing to put in the time to write the letters, to show up for peaceful demonstrations, to force the government to face up to this issue of SRA. It's not because of lack of resources or lack of capacity that the police do not investigate SRA as much as they should. It is because of the lack of will. And the police are sensitive to their public image. They're not simply indifferent. They're a bit like the politicians. They do care what the public think about them. And so they're not going to simply ignore it if, say, thousands of demonstrators showed up outside the police headquarters and said, we want you to do something about SRA. It's got to be peaceful demonstrations. We lose the moral high ground if we start to engage in violence, and it makes it easy for them to just paint us as troublemakers. Peaceful demonstrations, but persistent demonstrations, calling for action on SRA, calling for action on specific SRA cases that have been covered up, like the Hampstead SRA case, like the Holly Gregg SRA case, and sending the message, we care enough to show up for this demonstration, and we care enough to keep showing up until you do something effective on this issue. Then the message really gets through. Then people will take us a lot more seriously on our concerns about cover-ups of SRA. And all it will take to show up for these things is at the most a few days of our time. And imagine the long-term results we can get by doing this.
Yeah.
So acting now is going to go a long way to not only helping to protect children from SRA, but also helping to protect our freedoms. If we are willing to demonstrate, if we're willing to show up, if we're willing to take a few hours, or in some cases just 15, 20 minutes to write a letter to the relevant people who have influence about SRA. I can help write these letters. I can help draft letters on these issues if you need some suggestions, because we need to make it known in no uncertain terms to the people in power that we know what's going on. We know about the SRA cover-ups. We know about the corruption of the social services, the family courts, the police. We know how this is endangering children and serving children on a silver platter to the very people who have abused them. We know this, and we want something to be done about it, and to be done quickly and effectively on this issue. And of course, human rights campaigning by nature is repetitive, and we were going to have to repeat it over and over again. We will probably need to internationalize this issue. the UK likes to be seen, the UK government likes to be seen as a great paragon of human rights virtue, and to lecture other countries on their human rights shortcomings. Well, it's time to make it a more even playing field and let other countries lecture the UK on its failure to protect children from SRA, and lecture the UK on its cover-ups of child sex abuse as well, and give them the information to do this. And I know that there's an international audience who are concerned about SRA in the UK. I've had a lot of emails from people from different countries about SRA. After I did my interview with people like Sean Atwood, a lot of people from outside the UK were writing in support. So there's a growing international interest in this subject, not only about SRA in the UK, but SRA elsewhere as well. Now is the time, our time is coming now to move a lot more boldly and decisively and effectively on SRA. And no better time than now, when we've got all these increasing restrictions in line with the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has got people thinking and questioning how fragile their human rights and human freedoms are in reality. They always assume, oh, you know, they can't just take away all our freedoms overnight, can they? Well, they can, and they have
Just
done.
did. Yeah.
Just did. So wake up. Now is the time to wake up and smell the coffee, because otherwise, one day you'll find that you've got no more room for maneuver,
And
no more room to protest.
There's so many of us and only such a small minority of them, but yet people willingly so give over their sovereignty and their freedom, as we've seen these past couple of months. They'll complain about it, but they'll still give it over. And I mean, there's millions upon millions of us, billions of us globally, compared to a small minority of what they are. And yet we're bound down to it.
And we vastly outnumber the Satanists as well.
Yeah.
At present, we vastly outnumber the Satanists. One day they may outnumber us if we keep on sleeping on this subject. And we'll have no one to blame but ourselves for sleeping and being indifferent in the face of this growing menace and this growing slave master who is determined to remove step by step our freedoms and to interfere with our rights over our children, our rights of determining how we raise our children, increasingly interfered with by the state. We need to wake up to that fact and do something about it while we still have a chance to do something about it. Because one day, if we don't do something, it's going to end up with no more room to protest, no more room to object to these things, and we'll be left scratching our heads wondering, well, what happened? How did this happen? Where have all our freedoms gone?
Yeah. The time is closing in quick for people to act now and not leave it to somebody else to worry about it. Do take action yourself.
Yes, this is not just about people like myself and a few others who are speaking out on this subject, doing all the work or 90% of the work. No, this is about mobilizing an army of people who are willing to take action, but it's got to be wise action. They need to listen to the experiences of experienced people on this issue who have seen the mistakes that have been made, who have seen the tactics used by the Satanist abusers to sabotage the work being done against them, so that they don't end up like a naive person who can be easily exploited and undermined by the Satanists, so that they learn from the mistakes of the past and are as foolproof as one can be to Satanist infiltration, and not taken in by their tricks, not taken in by their intimidation, not letting the Satanists influence the quality of what they're doing. And if they're willing to learn from the mistakes of the past and the lessons of the past and take action, robust action, then yes, I think we can win. We can win in our generation anyway. We can stop the march and advance of the Satanist agenda we still have a window of opportunity there. We still have some time, but I wouldn't exaggerate the amount of time we got left. I think the COVID-19 pandemic should be a sharp wake-up call to how far the agenda is moving towards pushing us to a one-world government, a globalist agenda, a Satanist agenda, giving up our freedoms, being micromanaged basically on what we can do, when we can go out, what we do when we go out, being tracked. I mean, come on, even today, now you go to a pub, for example, they're asking for your phone number. Exactly. They're asking for your details in case we need to track you down because somebody was infected with COVID-19 and came into the pub and you were in some kind of proximity to them. We need to call you. Of course, they're going to call you so they can put you in quarantine yourself. House arrest, basically.
Yeah, collect your data.
And you've got to ask yourself, whatever happened to the GDPR, which was brought in by the EU, by the way, the General Data Protection Regulation that's supposed to protect our contact details, or the Data Protection Act. Now, as you can see in some pubs, all the names and numbers of the people visiting the pub are in a book. And all you need to do is take a camera, take a photo, and you've got all the contact details. Whatever happened to data protection, all that seems to be going out the window. And something I saw in London about over a month ago, which really brought home what the real agenda was. Despite all this constant bombarding of messages of stay 2 meters away from each other, social distancing, on and on and on, wear a mask, social distancing, repeat, wear a mask, social distancing, repeat, and on and on and on. You are just being indoctrinated all the time. And then the so-called Black Lives Matter demonstration was held in London. And suddenly, just like that, all the regulations on social distancing, all the regulations on wearing a mask went straight out the window. In the first place, why were they being given permission to demonstrate and flout all those regulations that have been pushed down our throat over the last couple of months repeatedly? I saw them with my own eyes. They were all not socially distanced. Most of them were not wearing a mask. The police, who were just watching them passively, were standing practically shoulder to shoulder, certainly no social distancing there, not wearing masks. Suddenly it was as if, well, we suspended all the rules on COVID-19. Somehow these people, because they're demonstrating for Black Lives Matter, are immune from COVID-19. The real reason, of course, is that this whole demonstrations about the so-called Black Lives Matter groups and the Antifa, so-called anti-fascist groups, the real agenda, who are the real fascist groups. The real agenda is nothing whatsoever to do with fighting racism against Black people. Their cause, which is a legitimate cause, protecting the Black people from racism, is a legitimate cause, but it's not their cause, despite their name. It's false advertising, their name. It's false advertising. It has been hijacked by people who are only interested in establishing the new world order, the Satanist new world order. And
such as Soros.
Exactly, and they're funded by Soros.
Exactly.
The key goal of Black Lives Matter and Antifa is stop Donald Trump having a second term as president. He is an obstacle, regarded as a major obstacle to the New World Order. He must be removed. So all the pandemic regulations, and the pandemic was, I believe, manufactured in the first place to promote the advancement of the New World Order. So it had to wreck the economic success in the US that Trump had achieved. It had to improve the chances of getting Trump out of the presidency in this November's elections. And the Antifa and Black Lives Matter riots are all geared in that same direction. So the rules and regulations to supposedly protect the public from COVID-19 had to be suspended to allow all these riots to take place, including allowing the Black Lives Matter demonstrations to take place in London. Got to ask yourself, why, when the government keeps emphasizing social distancing, that they simply suddenly seem to forget about social distancing whenever Black Lives Matter wanted to have a demonstration in England? Oh, suddenly all the rules went out the window. You've got a free pass. Go ahead and demonstrate, because that is it for the advancement of the New World Order agenda.
Exactly.
And I saw it so starkly with my own eyes when I saw them. Suddenly, London had gone back to the way it was before COVID-19. All the rules were ignored, including being ignored by the very police who were supposed to police those rules and were present at the Black Lives Matter demonstration. It was just such a clear example of the double standards and what the real agenda is: discredit Trump, get Trump out, destroy the UK economy, destroy the US economy to help advance the New World Order agenda. Show the world that the UK cannot prosper economically outside the EU. Show the world that Trump's economic success was only fragile and short-lived, and now they're in terrible trouble economically. And a lot of the world is as well, preparing the way for, looking for a savior to come along and solve their economic problems, solve their pandemic problems, solve their climate change problems. So the world will be open to this global savior, whoever that person is, as and when that person rises to power. And that person will make people like Hitler and Joseph Stalin, by comparison, look like choir boys, because he will be 1,000 times more vicious, 1,000 times more evil, if you can imagine such a person, and 1,000 times more devious and successful at misleading people than even Hitler or Joseph Stalin were. You know, there's a saying that war is deception, and we're right in the middle of that war now, and the Satanists are masters of deception. Mm. So we haven't asked for this war. This war has been imposed upon us and on children who are suffering right at the front line of this war against Satanism and SRA. But we can make a choice, and we have to make a choice whether we're going to get involved and do our bit fighting this war, or just be ignoring the war and being totally ignorant. War? What war? And live in a state of perpetual ignorance. Yeah.
I was going to ask you to touch on a bit on which I think is important, is symbolism, because you see a lot of it worldwide, and you see an awful lot of it in Hollywood, for example. There seems to be tons of it around the place, even obvious in your face. You see the music industry, be it on the Beatles cover. You see Aleister Crowley, the iconic figure here from England that loads of Satanists look up to still to this day. You've got Black Sabbath have a song called Mr. Crowley. You have Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, who, as far as I know, bought Aleister Crowley's house up in Scotland at one stage. And he said he wrote most of his best music in that house, which most people that are into Led Zeppelin probably never even knew this. Why do you believe there's all this Satanism symbolism going around? Some of it is obvious in the music industry. Some of it's very obvious in Hollywood. Do you feel it's another case of infiltration? Or some people just kind of think, oh, it looks cool? What's your kind of thoughts on that?
The Satanists believe that when they display their symbols, that they will get more power from that. So we come back to the core objective of Satanists, which is to get themselves more power and more power for the devil as well. And they believe that all of them benefit from getting more power, including the devil, when they display their symbols publicly. Sometimes they will hide those symbols in plain sight, playing on public ignorance, public indifference. Sometimes they will put their symbols on their Facebook page. That's why I encourage people, if they suspect someone is a Satanist, try and look at their Facebook page, if they have one, or other social media accounts. One suspected Satanist infiltrator, I found an upside down cross under her desk. And guess where her desk was? Right inside a church that she was supposed to be working for. And she's got a little upside down cross under her desk.
Wow.
How interesting. So they are so desperate to get power from these symbols that they're willing to risk being detected, putting it on Facebook page, putting it on under their office desk, putting it wherever they think they can get away with it. But often, if people like myself are around, we will see it, and it will help confirm to us their real core beliefs, real beliefs are Satanism, not what they're pretending to be, whether they're pretending to be a Christian or something else. They trip themselves up sometimes in their eagerness to get the power from the symbolism. And it's good to bear that in mind. They are also, symbols mean a lot to Satanists. Not only they believe they can get power, they know it's a powerful way of communicating. That's postmodernism. Postmodernism puts a lot of weight on symbols. So yes, look out for the symbols. It's a way of confirming your suspicions about these people. If they are reckless enough to try and put those symbols out, yeah, by all means, try and detect them.
And also, you were saying you know some ex-Satanists that have left. How are they affected today after leaving, after being in it for so many years, that at the time they were in it, obviously I presume they were leading like a double life, and they eventually got out, but they've seen these heinous torture crimes to children and all sorts of sex orgies and rituals and stuff that went on, and burying people alive. How did those people, when you actually meet them, when they come to you and they've eventually got out, how was their mindset from then on? I mean, to get out alone, to get the mind to get themselves out of it, must have been difficult in itself. But now when they feel they're somewhat away from it, how does that person kind of interact with society again after being through something that was so unnormal for years and years?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer to your question is, obviously it's not easy for them to get out, but it is possible. And the fact that they're willing to persevere and to keep on trying to get out is a testimony to their strength of will, and you could say desperation to get out. I think they have to really want to get out to make it successful in their exit. It's not impossible to get out. It is possible. And people like them have demonstrated that if you really want it, you can get out, and get out in one piece. And of course, if they have already started to have a faith in God, they should call on God to help them get out. That will make it so much easier, because obviously God wants them out and is going to help them get out if they're willing to trust in Him and call on Him for His help. One interesting thing that I've noticed is that when Satanists leave Satanism behind them, they go instinctively, like moths to the light. They will head instinctively to where the real light is, which is God. And so all the ex-Satanists I know and have met are Christians. They instinctively know that the very group that Satanists hate so much and are so opposed to is the group that they should go to. And they head for that group because if you've been in the darkness for so long, you're desperate to go to where the real light is, not the false light of Satanism, not the fake light that Satanism offers, but to the real light. And so we have this source of information as well when they come out of what the Satanists get up to. We don't just get it from SRA survivors, we can also get it from former Satanists. They want to expose the darkness of Satanism. One person I know who got out of Satanism even wrote a book about it to expose what she saw when she was in Satanism, how God helped her to get out. And I know that she was, for some time when she was able to work, before she got too old and had too many health problems to carry on, she was going to different churches to warn them not just about Satanism, but about the occult in general and the dangers of the occult in general. But she would also do interviews about Satanism and her experiences. And she wrote a second book, which was about how more help is needed for SRA survivors. And she tried to help the SRA survivors that came her way, that came to her for assistance. Which is interesting, isn't it, that SRA survivor would go to an ex-Satanist for help. But they know that the ex-Satanist knows what they've been through and knows that what they're talking about is real, not fake, because this ex-Satanist saw with her own eyes ritual sacrifice, ritual abuse taking place. I think there's also an element there where they want to try and make amends for their former lifestyle. They've seen the light, their eyes have been opened to the evil that they used to be involved in, and they want to help expose it to the public and warn the public about it, because the Satanists are always trying to recruit more people. More people will inevitably mean more SRA. More people in Satanism, and they pass the Satanism on to the next generation down the family line. Inevitably, that means more SRA. So you cannot really separate Satanism from SRA. As I said earlier, without Satanism, there would be no SRA, and the more Satanism there is means inevitably more SRA. And they want to do something about it practically by warning people, by campaigning against it. I know of an ex-Satanist who has organized demonstrations against, well, generally speaking, child sex abuse cover-ups, but that would include SRA cover-ups.
That's
good news.
Yeah.
Another ex-Satanist, she shared with me a lot of valuable information that I know because of her fears and the way that she's been attacked in the past by a certain newspaper that is quite well known for covering up SRA, that she's not likely anytime soon to publicly talk about the things she shared with me. So I try to spread the message without naming her myself, and that's the one who exposed the fact that the EU is under Satanist control and domination.
And how do Satanists recruit?
They have various different ways of recruitment. One, of course, is you're born into it. You got no choice. Don't try to leave. You've got to come to the Satanist rituals. They try and corrupt you from young so that you think that what the Satanists are doing is actually good. But they're doing the opposite of good, but they want you to believe that evil is good and good is evil. And if you're brought up that way, you know no better, and you're more likely to think, oh yeah, Satanism, that's a great religion because I think what they're doing is good.
Yeah, so they know no better.
Yeah. Another way is to attract young people through music groups, through giving them a false, more sanitized version of Satanism, appealing to young people's need for freedom, or their perceived need for freedom, and their openness to rebelling against authority, rebelling against the rules, and using the devil as a kind of symbol of rebellion, just as the devil rebelled against God. And this is becoming more used by Satanists as part of their message to the young. You want to rebel? Well, the devil's the ultimate rebel. Come and join us. We'll give you an outlet for all sorts of rebellion. Rebellion against morality of society, rebellion against all Judeo-Christian values, rebellion against anything that's perceived traditionally as good. And that attracts some young people. And by the time they find out that this is pretty dark and pretty awful, it's probably too late for them to try and leave. So that's one of the other ways that they will recruit people. They're always targeting the young. Children, teenagers is a common target for them to go after. Another reason why they like to get jobs that put them in a place to access young people, access children. Recruitment can also be in ways of, for example, going to people who obviously have a lot of need, such as homeless people or low-income people. And I know one coven that likes to focus on that a lot, at least one coven, but I think it's quite a extensive method used by Satanists. And it's how one of the ex-Satanists that I know was recruited in the first place, because she was homeless and she was invited to a rather posh house who had a lot of nice things, these women. They treated her very well. They were very posh, wealthy women, giving her a taste of the kind of lifestyle that she could only dream of as a homeless woman, and showing her that if she joined them, she could get the same things. Well, that's at least the bait that they used to tempt her. So she did join them. She did end up with this posh upper middle class Satanists and their coven. When I use the word coven, I'm describing the group. Just as you use the word coven for witches, Satanists are in effect black witches. But I prefer to just call them Satanists because it's a lot clearer. And if I call them witches, then the white witches would be included, but the white witches are not strictly speaking Satanists. It's the black witches. And the coven was where she stayed for some years before she started wanting to get out, and eventually managed to get out. And her comments were, she was tempted by the rich lifestyle of the members of the coven. She thought, because she grew up in poverty as an orphan, she had nothing, and thought that she could change her situation by joining the coven, but she ended up poor, still as poor as she was before when she left the coven. But she also said that the Satanists lied a lot, and they lied to her that she would get the riches. And the devil, after all, is described by Jesus in the Bible as the father of lies. So it's not always the case that the promise of wealth and power that the Satanists make will come true. In many cases, it doesn't, but it's a very tempting bait that they use to recruit people. I know of a coven that specifically targets homeless and low-income people and promises them not necessarily great riches, but things that they would consider as big riches. For example, a job, a roof over their heads, an income. They often will take the bait, but once they realize what they've signed up to, it's too late for them to get out. It's too dangerous for them to get out, or at least that's how they think. So they end up sometimes, sadly, being the sacrificial victim for the coven, the ritual sacrifice. I think the mentality of the coven members is better you than me. It's great that I've got you in the coven. You're going to be the ritual sacrifice, which decreases the chances that I end up eventually as the ritual sacrifice. So I know that, I know that the coven has sacrificed several homeless or low-income people at their rituals in the past, and will continue to do so until they are exposed, brought to justice, shut down, and that they prey on these vulnerable, poor adults. And it's easy to offer these things as very tempting bait to a homeless person. And it's so tragic because the homeless people that have enough hardships to deal with without being preyed on by Satanists. I actually went around warning in this particular area the homeless people, those that I could find, about the Satanists. None of them gave me the, oh, Satanism doesn't exist, SRA doesn't exist, bull. I think because homeless people, they're a lot more in touch with the realities of life and the hardships and the harsh realities of life. So they know the depths that people can stoop to, and they're not so naive as to disbelieve. And all of them accepted that this danger was out there for them. And I was warning them, they may offer you things that you really want, like jobs, regular income, accommodation. Unless you have good information on these people that they are trustworthy, do not go with them, or you're going to be ending up as their captive and eventually probably as their sacrifice. And one of the homeless people said, oh, a homeless woman that he knew has been missing for weeks, and she may have ended up as one of their sacrifices, or at least their prisoner. They usually hold the person prisoner for some months before they get sacrificed. So this is one clear, stark example of how a coven may operate in targeting, recruiting, and eventually sacrificing their recruits. They don't necessarily sacrifice all these recruits from the homeless and low-income groups, but they are quite ready to sacrifice several of them. I know from their past practice. But I also know that sometimes some of their members do have a desire to get out. There may be people who join in the first place on very false understanding of what they're getting themselves into, and have found it difficult to get out once they understood what they signed up to, but would like to get out if they had a chance. It's quite a dangerous coven when it comes to trying to leave without their agreement. And that is the situation at present. What I'm hoping will eventually happen is that they will be exposed and brought to justice. And this will free a lot of the people inside who want to get out, and it will save the future victims of this coven from being recruited under false pretenses and eventually sacrificed.
And the sacrifices, does it vary from coven to coven? As in, is it something that they have to sacrifice once a month, or is it a case, like you're saying, on Halloween or certain dates of the year? I mean, is there a certain quota, I should say, per year that universally overall, from your experience, that these covenants sort of have to sacrifice? Be it if it's not a human this month, maybe we'll do an animal instead another month, or is there a difference in that, the way they view it?
They have different practices from coven to coven. This particular coven that I've been talking about have a favored date for human sacrifice, which in their particular case, not necessarily the case of other covens, although there probably are some covens who would use this date as well for human sacrifice, is Good Friday. They make a mockery of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross for our sins on Good Friday. They make a mockery of that by sacrificing their human victims. They love Good Friday, but they really hate Easter Sunday, because that's when Jesus came back to life. So they like to believe and trick themselves into thinking that, oh, we killed God on Good Friday. Yeah, God is dead. We killed God on Good Friday. We succeeded in that. And we're going to make fun of Jesus' sacrifice by sacrificing a human victim. That's why this coven, and probably not only this coven, but some others as well, favors a human sacrifice on that date. On other dates, they may do animal sacrifices, or maybe perhaps some other dates they may do human sacrifices, but I know for sure that they do human sacrifices on Good Friday. Some covens put a lot of weight on Good Friday. One ex-Satanist even claimed that Good Friday, at least for her, is more important than, for her when she was a Satanist, and her fellow Satanists apparently, was important for them more so than Halloween, which is quite a sort of minority view, I would say, among Satanists. Because in her words, this is when the Satanists believed that God was murdered, God was killed off. They, of course, close an eye to his resurrection 3 days later. That doesn't fit the narrative, so ignore that. So this is an example of how they may recruit not only members, recruit potential victims into their covens. I know of one Satanist who was even, one person who was even invited to a Satanist ritual to attend as a kind of observer, to see if you like it, have a look, and see if you want to join us. That's an interesting way to do it, because they're exposing themselves quite a bit security-wise by doing that. The person, in my understanding, did go, but was quite horrified by what they saw and did not return, but was too afraid to reveal to me anyway, what they had seen, what they knew about that particular coven. But it does illustrate that sometimes they may stick their neck out and just, because they've got an eye on a certain person, invite them to come. And of course, the wise thing to do is say no, don't go anywhere near them, because they may take your presence there as a sign of agreement to join. They may commit a crime there that you are too afraid to blow the whistle on. They may even try and involve you in the crime, for example, human sacrifice, and force you to get involved, whether you like it or not, because obviously you're just one person there and they'll outnumber you. So you're exposing yourself in a very reckless way if you actually say yes to that kind of invitation. The Satanists are looking for any excuse to force you into their coven. And your very presence at their meeting may be seen as an agreement on your part to become one of them. So if you're unfortunate enough to get that invitation, do not go. Do not even show any interest in what they believe in, what they do. As the saying goes, don't touch them with a barge pole, so that there's no room for implying that you want to join them or that you're interested in joining them.
Do you believe in the old saying, whether it's a myth or not? I know Bob Dylan, I heard him saying it online as well, is that you can actually sell your soul to the devil. So some people say they can get 10 years of being in a rock band or 20 years of happiness, but you've sold your soul. A lot of people believe in it. Other people say, no, it's only a myth. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the Satanists demand full commitment. If you join their coven, it is common practice to sign a covenant with the devil, promising your loyalty and obedience to the devil, and to sign it in your own blood. Just shows you how demanding the devil is of one's commitment. If you follow him, it's nothing like, for example, people who become Christians and give their allegiance to God. At least the God of Christianity does not expect you to sign a covenant with him in blood. No, we have a thing called baptism. You are not under pressure from coven members. Unlike Christianity, you face strong pressure from the members of the coven that you join to toe the line, to turn up for meetings. And we're talking about long meetings. The average Satanist ritual is much longer than the average church meeting. In fact, one ex-Satanist in America was criticizing Christians after he joined Christianity and left Satanism for not being able to stay focused for just 90 minutes, 2 hours that the Christian meetings may last. Because when he was a Satanist, they would on average take a couple of hours. My understanding is the average is 5 hours for their rituals. I know of a coven that meets at least 4 times a week, if not more, every week. You're talking a huge commitment there. These people have day jobs, but they also meet at night 4 times a week, at least every week. Not counting the significant dates in the calendar, not counting the birth dates when they usually meet, birth dates of their coven members. It's like a rule, minimum 4 times a week, every week. That is commitment. I have said in the past that the commitment of these Satanist abusers to their belief system, as evil as it is like the commitment that you see Islamic extremists having to their beliefs. It's a very, you could say, fanatical kind of commitment. It is something that you see time and time again in history, that those who are committed to evil are far more strongly committed than those who are committed to good. It's a sad fact of history, but you see it time and time again. If you believe in the good, then you have to show it in your actions and your commitment. but your commitment is usually going to be, in my observation, it's often a bit half-hearted. It's not as strong as the commitment of those who do evil. So look at how committed the SS were to the Nazi cause, how committed the Islamic extremists are to their cause, and they're willing to die for it. How committed the Satanists are to give up so much time to their cause and so much energy and focus. This is what we see over and over again in history. Those committed to evil are committed heart and soul to their cause. And the sort of things we complain about, sacrifices, etc., for them, it's nothing, it's a small thing. I have seen a lot of people starting off with good intentions on working against SRA, but when they run into some difficulty or criticism, they start to get cold feet, they start to have second thoughts, they want to back out, they change their mind. You've got to have the kind of commitment that a person has to have in any war, because this is a war, both a physical and a spiritual war, that is willing to sacrifice, that is willing to put in the hours, the commitment to stick the neck out. If you want a conflict where you can fight in comfort and have a comfortable, easy commitment, which doesn't demand too much of you, then that's not very realistic when it comes to fighting SRA. But you can put in a little commitment if you want and do something useful, like, for example, writing a letter. Doesn't take very long to write a letter if you have been provided with a suggested letter as a guide. And you could say, yes, well, that's as far as I'm going to go. And you're still doing something useful, and it's a small commitment, but it's still something useful. Ideally, you should be willing to go further than that. As I said earlier, turn up for demonstrations, share the message on SRA with your contacts and friends, and ask them to share it on with their contacts and friends, and get the message out as far as and wide as you can. It doesn't take much time or commitment to do that, and you can achieve a lot with that. And if that's as far as you want to go, okay. It would help a lot if you're going further than that, but it's better than nothing.
What do you find is your biggest challenge doing the work you've been doing for 27 years now?
My view of the biggest challenge is probably summed up in two words. Indifference and or disbelief. Indifference and or disbelief. A third word that could probably sum up another big obstacle is fear. People often are paralyzed in the face of issues like SRA because of fear. It's a very irrational fear. It's a very sort of knee-jerk fear of anything that is dark. I always say, you know, if you believe in the good, you believe in the light that comes from goodness, or the light that comes from God, who is the ultimate good in my view, then you should strongly believe that where the darkness exists is most in need of light. It's like if you go into a dark wood, and I have been out in the dark woods many times, you realize how important it is to have a light there. Because one moment you're in the dark woods and you're not really sure perhaps where you're going and what you're even going to step into with your next step. And suddenly when you switch on a light, even if it's a small torch, it makes such a huge positive difference. Because there's so much darkness, a little light can go a long way. So it's very irrational to think that, oh, because it's so dark, I don't want to be a light there. But it is the darkness that needs the light most. It's the darkness where we need most to bring the light into. So Jesus Christ did say in the Bible, it's recorded in Matthew chapter 5, I believe, that those who follow him should be salt and light in the world. And that a light should not hide itself, but be open, because a light that hides itself is not going to be of much use or any use. But the light is useful when it is exposed in the darkness, and it will light up and change and transform the darkness. We need to be light in this darkness. We can be light in this darkness, and we ought to be light in this darkness. And there's a very wise saying that it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. We can transform the darkness by just being light in there and bringing light in there. Even if we have one small candle to offer, we will make a difference. And if many people are willing to bring their one relatively small candle into that darkness, we are going to have lots and lots of light in that darkness. We can be a light in the darkness, each of us, we should be. We should recognize that it is this darkness that needs the light most. So whenever I'm exposing SRA, whenever I'm working against SRA, I see it as bringing more light into that darkness. And of course, the ultimate light, which I believe is God, can help us to bring far more light into that darkness and to effectively transform it, because light and darkness cannot exist side by side. The light will automatically, by its very presence, transform the darkness into light. For the sake of the victims of SRA, the current victims and the future victims of SRA, and also the past victims, we should bring our light into the darkness. We all have a light to offer if we want to see good triumph over evil. If we want to see good win this battle, we all should do our bit to bring light into that darkness. And the light will also expose the darkness. In the Bible, in the book of Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, we are told to expose the deeds of the darkness. Expose the deeds of darkness. What better way to do it than to shine a light on it? And fighting SRA starts with exposure. We have to expose the darkness of SRA. Once we shine a light on it, a lot of the battle is won. Once it becomes well known what SRA does and involves and how it damages children and vulnerable adults, a lot of the battle is won. Not the whole battle, there's still a way to fight, but exposure is one of our big guns to use in this battle. People underestimate their capacity to be a light in the darkness, or they don't even think about it. I think if we wake up to the fact that all of us are put in this world for a purpose that involves in our own way, in our own calling, bringing light into the darkness, we're not just going to complain about the darkness in the world. We will be thinking, what can I do on my part to be a light in this darkness? And if we don't realize our capacity to be a light in the darkness and act on it, then we're not fulfilling, I believe, our destiny. We're not fulfilling our calling, which would be a great shame, because we only got one life to live, one life to contribute light into the darkness. It is a dark world, but that's all the more reason why we should do our bit to bring light into it. And of course, if we have that personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ, we will have the ultimate light working with us and enabling us to bring even more light into the darkness. So let's examine our part. Let's see how we can light up the darkness. Don't make excuses about, oh, it's too dark, it's so dark, I don't want to go anywhere near it. Well, perhaps this is a key reason why you have been learning or made aware of this issue. And a key reason why you are here in the first place is to contribute to exposing this evil. All the people who've made a difference on dark issues, for example, William Wilberforce on slavery, had to go against the indifference of their generation on that issue. The blind spot, the big blind spot of William Wilberforce's generation was slavery. And he was one of the few people who could see the evil in it and that something had to be done about it, and was willing to do something about it.
Which at that time, it wouldn't have been a popular time to make a change.
No. So I say to people, yeah, you can and you should, recognize the great contribution made by people of the past like William Wilberforce. But they were very unpopular when they spoke about it. Imagine all the economic vested interests in slavery at that time would have made William Wilberforce as popular as a rat at a dinner party by talking about slavery openly. I'm sure there are a lot of people saying, as some people say today on SRA, you can't talk about it. You shouldn't talk about it. It's not a subject for conversation. It's a taboo subject. Just as people are trying to dress up, especially the Satanists are trying to dress up SRA as a subject you shouldn't be publicly talking about. Of course, that's rubbish, that's nonsense. And Wilberforce started by educating people about the reality of what slavery does, the damage it does. He didn't have the benefits we have now of films, of photographs. He had to hire somebody to go and draw pictures of the conditions that slaves lived in. We have a lot of benefits to get the message across. We have modern technology, which he didn't have, but he managed to get the message across with the means he had in his time, such as drawings, art, and he had to expose the graphic reality. Yes, there'll be a lot of people, as in this generation, who complain, oh, this is too graphic. We can't show this, it's too graphic. All the polite, so-called polite society are going to be too shocked.
Correctness,
not only political correctness, I've sadly had some Christians not liking me describing the reality of SRA. I have actually described the reality in at least one church congregation. And you could see their jaws drop when I did this. But afterwards, they were so supportive. And I told them, I'm sorry I have to do this, but I need you to understand the reality of SRA. because I know SRA survivors who have gone to the church for help and have been disbelieved. So when you hear these horrible things that I'm describing to you now, coming from a survivor, you will know that this person is not out to trick you or deceive you. They're just telling you what actually happened to them. And they understood and they accepted it. They were mature enough to understand that. Sadly, there are some Christians who are not of that level of maturity to accept and understand the truth. So they shut down when you talk about the reality of SRA. And I'm sure that Wilberforce had that problem with some people, whether they were Christians or not, when he talked about the reality of slavery and the graphic awfulness involved in slavery, just as when I exposed the graphic awfulness, as I did in this interview, involved in SRA.
What would be one of the worst cases you've come across as far as SRA goes in your previous 27 years?
It's hard to say that one is more terrible than another, because I think from the victim's point of view, in all these cases, they will tell you it was just the most awful thing. It was just the most horrific thing. Sometimes just when you think, oh, right, this must be, for a horrific subject, touching the depths of horror, then another case comes along that seems to go even further down into the depths. As I said earlier, the problem is that people have ways of engaging in even more awful things than their predecessors have. And so you may think, oh, well, we lived in a more enlightened society now. Well, that's rubbish. We have misused our technology, our sophistication, our education, in many cases, to go even further into the depths of depravity than previous generations have. And we can do more damage because of the technology that we have. So for example, using the technology to record SRA on film, many covens do that. They will film the abuse they do. I think that at least some of this is being sold as pornography for profit reasons, but they also want a record of what they do. The big question is, where do they put it? So far, it hasn't been found by people who they are hiding it from, but it's out there. They like to film their own depravity and keep a record of it on film. And I suspect that they do share it with other Satanist abusers, and they probably try and make a profit from it as pornography when they can. The terrible things they do to their victims, I touched on some of them just now. It's not, I don't think it's possible to really make a comparison. Well, this is much more worse than the other. Plus, you've got to look at it from the victim's point of view, that all of them are suffering terribly and they go through these things. So you can't really compare a child being electrocuted with a child being drowned. I mean, they're both being deeply traumatized by it. Or a child being hung, suspended from a hook or from a rope, or a child being raped. All these things happen at various Satanist rituals. Or a child being burned alive. I know of at least one case where a child was burned alive, 4-year-old child. The creativity, so to speak, of the people who inflict these evil deeds, the Satanist abusers who come up with these things and inflict them, seems to know no bounds. And you could probably say with a lot of accuracy, come from the devil himself. The devil is not some lovable, misunderstood rebel. He touches the depths of depravity and perversity. He is probably rightly described as the biggest pervert in the world and the oldest pervert in the world. Just when you think the limits of perversion have been reached by certain Satanist groups, the boundaries will be pushed even further. And they're always pushing the boundaries of their agenda. And just as a heads up, a warning, what is down the road for us, what they would like to see mainstreamed in our society, we need to be aware that this will include the legalizing of pedophilia, the legalizing of sex relations between adults and boys and girls. This has already been put on the agenda by some people. There has been, I know of at least one in the UK anyway, one conference that suggests discuss this seriously and at an academic level. And guess who organized the conference, gave the platform for academics from elsewhere in the UK to come and say, well, sex relations between adults and children are acceptable, actually, and should be natural, should be accepted as natural. It was organized by Cambridge University a couple of years ago. And the academics who said this did not necessarily come from Cambridge University, came from other UK universities. But see how the academics are starting at least to try and make the case that this is acceptable, this is normal. We should just see it as a kind of normal sexual orientation. Welcome to the new normal. First, the new normal was LGBT. Now the new normal extends to, guess what? Pedophilia. So some people call it LGBTP. And I know someone who got an email from one of these pro-pedophilia campaigners, which said LGBTP, and for P they wrote, and this was also mentioned at the conference, I believe, that was organized by Cambridge, because love has no age limits. What a misleading and manipulative slogan. But they're going to be using some of the tactics used by the LGBT agenda. Oh, well, as long as they love each other. Oh, well, as long as this 50-year-old man loves this 5-year-old girl, it's love. Who are we to stand in front of the man having sex with the child? That's where we're headed now. And of course, the Satanists are backing it to the hilt. The leader of the Satanic Temple in the United States publicly said last year that the LGBT agenda is only one front in the Satanic revolution. That's very interesting. First, it's the first time I've heard the phrase Satanic revolution used, not by an outsider, but by a Satanist himself, a Satanist leader. One front, he has admitted, is the LGBT agenda. What are the other fronts? That begs the question, what the other fronts are. And I would say, the way things are going, the other front is going to include definitely legitimization and legalization of pedophilia, legalization of infanticide. There are some academics seriously talking now about infanticide being acceptable and should be acceptable. legalization of assisted suicide comes back to what I said earlier about the ex-Satanists saying that Satanists love death and they love to spread death. What better way than assisted suicide? Put pressure on people, oh, you're a burden, you should kill yourself, and get them to feel guilty enough to consent to assisted suicide. Lots of vulnerable people, and as I said earlier, Satanists love to target vulnerable adults, are going to be targeted under this. So it's expanding the legalization of killing, basically, whether it's under the guise of euthanasia or assisted suicide. It's also a form of eugenics. It's a form of elitism, depopulation. Your life is deemed by the elite, the powers that be, not to be worth living. So therefore, you should do the so-called decent thing and kill yourself and have yourself killed. Suicide is actually a weapon used by Satanists against their opponents. They try to get them to commit suicide. And sometimes they put, in fact, in many occasions, they may put suicide triggers in the mind control of their victims. So that if their victims are out of the Satanist coven and are seemingly free from the Satanist coven, despite their being apart from the coven, they still have certain suicide triggers embedded in them in some cases, in the mind control they were subjected to. And if they are triggered, then they might commit suicide, which for the Satanists is very convenient. Get rid of the witness, get rid of the potential whistleblower, get rid of the person who left our coven and is apparently free from our coven. And sometimes Satanists may infiltrate the therapy profession so that they are in a position, if they are dealing with an SRA survivor, to try and trigger those suicide triggers that have been put into that survivor through mind control techniques. I'm not saying that every survivor has suicide triggers, but many do. And the SRA, the Satanist infiltrators posing as therapists will know that and will try and trigger it in some cases, because what better way to silence a potential whistleblower than to just have them kill themselves?
Exactly. And what do you say to the victims that might be listening and watching in right now?
I would say if you're a victim and you are needing help, whether with therapy or with trying to get justice against your abusers or other forms of practical help, you can contact me and we can discuss it. And although I'm not a therapist, I could try and help you get a good therapist, point you in the direction of a good therapist, or point you in the direction of an organization that can help lead you to a good therapist. If you need help trying to get justice, I can do the same, either assist you in a campaign for justice or assist you in investigating your case, or point you to an organization that can help you with that kind of assistance. If you are, for example, not in the UK, but perhaps in the USA, I can point you towards people there that can help you with this sort of thing. So that's what I do in practice. If I can't give the help directly, then I might know someone I can refer them to. But I need you to summarize as clearly as you can your story. It helps if you give it in a chronological order. Because if I'm confused about the facts of your story, it's hard to understand your needs and communicate your needs. If I'm referring you to another group or another person, to communicate your needs to them, I need to have a clear understanding of your story. And you're obviously the best person as the victim to summarize it in a couple of paragraphs, what your story is, what your needs are, and to do it in a chronological order. So that's one way I can help if you're in need. There is a limit to how much I'm able to help, but what I normally do is that if I can't help, I try and find someone who I trust will be in a good position to help you. And of course, it starts off with you telling me your story in as clear a way as you can. You don't have to go into all the little details, just a summary of it, and email it to me. It's always so much easier if I have it in writing rather than over the phone, because it's going to be a very expensive, long phone call for me to take notes of everything you're saying over the phone. It's so much easier. You just write it down and send it, and take your time writing it. You don't have to send me that account immediately or in the next week or so, as long as you eventually send it to me. It just depends on you how urgently you need help. I think it's so important to get law enforcement against these abuses. That's why I'm always willing to do what I can to help SRA survivors try and find justice, to get the police to investigate their case, to get a prosecution against their abusers. It's usually, unfortunately, a long process for many SRA survivors in the UK anyway, because as we discussed earlier, the police are a lot of the time not doing their job on SRA.
And where can people actually find you and actually support you as well?
I would suggest email me. I'll give you my email address to...
Yeah, I'll leave the links in the description below.
And the link to my website as well. But the best, most direct way to contact me is just email me at my email address.
So, Wilfred, any final thoughts?
Final thoughts would be, don't give up the fight on SRA, or if you're a victim fighting for justice in your case, don't give up the fight. Or if you're fighting to get healing, don't give up that fight either. You never really fail until you give up. Keep going. You never fail until you give up. Second thing, children are always worth fighting for. Children are always worth fighting for. Keep fighting for the children, to protect them from SRA and also to protect the vulnerable adults. All this is well worth fighting for, and to keep going. Don't give the Satanists the pleasure of seeing you give up. Even if you have to take baby steps sometimes, at least you're taking baby steps in the right direction. Just keep going bit by bit, day by day. And eventually you'll get there. Fighting SRA is like ultra marathon. So you've got to pace yourself. It's a long journey, but eventually if you just keep going, even if you're walking there, you will get to the finish line. I think things are getting better in terms of public exposure of SRA. I think things are getting better in terms of public belief in SRA's existence. But we need to keep pushing at that open door so that the progress is even more rapid and going faster, because for the sake of the victims, we need to try and get there faster to the finish line. of getting action against SRA. And there's always something you can do. Don't think, oh, there's nothing I can do. No, that's rubbish. That's giving up before you even started. It's what the Satanists want you to believe is that you can't do anything. Of course you can do something. Everybody can do something. And I can advise you, if necessary, on what you can do, although I have already described a lot of what can be done in the course of our interview. And you can just watch and re-watch that section of the interview to understand better what action you can take on SRA.
Wilfred, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today. It's been incredible and such a worthy cause and such a topic people really, really need to hear and expose. So thank you again.
Sure. My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been watching Mindwars, Be the Resistance, and I'll see you on the inside.